sorry I can't join you in person. Hopefully coming in remotely will work. Yes, I'm talking about the dissolved nutrients section of the consensus statement, which is a part of that was I led the contribution to. And we're talking about the different parts of that. So, you know, in all there were nearly 1,300 studies reviewed. They covered, you know, quite a wide range of the aspects relevant to dissolved nutrients and the GBR. So where they occur and when they occur, the impact on the reef, the relationship with crown of thorns outbreaks, and you can see the leaders of these different subsections of the dissolved nutrients part listed on the slide. The characteristics of the sources, the drivers of the exports out of catchments and how that changes over time, the particular subsection that I led with about half a dozen other people on the management of the discharge at the field level, and also the economics of that. Efficacy of wetlands by Nathan, who also looked at the natural and near natural wetlands and ecosystem services. And then, you know, more detailed look at the economics of wetlands and other treatment systems by me. So, dissolved nutrients, you know, the agricultural development, particularly cropping and sugarcane is the biggest part of that, have increased the export of dissolved nitrogen and phosphorus, with inorganic nitrogen exports being 1.5 to 3 times greater than they were prior to development of the catchments. And, you know, this has been a consistent story through many of the consensus statements, and I've been involved in quite a few of the previous ones. You know, reducing fertiliser applications is the most effective and profitable practice for reducing dissolved nutrient exports. Wetlands, you know, natural ones or close to natural ones and healthy rivers have the potential to support these water quality improvements, but there's still a lot about wetlands that, you know, we don't know in the context of the Great Barrier Reef. So talking a bit more about the sources, you know, catchment basins dominated by sugarcane make the greatest contribution of dissolved nutrients. Grazing lands, approximately half that at 22%. And yes, there are dissolved nutrients generated by other land uses. They are smaller overall, although they can be quite locally important in catchments. Erosion from grazing lands or wherever also contribute to dissolved nutrient exports, because while the sediments that are eroded from those lands, the nutrients are bound up in those sediments and are not dissolved, they can transform into the dissolved form, which is a bioavailable form, during the movement through creeks and rivers and out into the ocean. And the drivers of nitrogen and phosphorus exports are fertiliser application, and as well as we talked before about like the wetlands change catchment hydrology and erosion. Of course, these affect, you know, the transport and transformation of sediments. Coming back onto practice. The most effective practice for both improving water quality and profitability is to reduce fertiliser applications. That's clear, and it's particularly clear if you're talking about reductions from above industry recommended levels to industry recommended levels. However, there's some complexity around this in that the optimum application rate, so that's the application of nitrogen in particular to get either maximum yield or near maximum yield, however you want to define the optimum, is quite uncertain. It changes from year to year in a given paddock, or from paddock to paddock. And the other thing is, while we know overall that reducing nitrogen applications reduces water quality impacts and also as a cost saving, there comes a stage where, if the reduction in nitrogen fertiliser is too large, it impacts on profitability and therefore productivity and therefore profitability. And so the uncertainties around just exactly what the right amount of nitrogen and phosphorus is, and these potential impacts on productivity and profitability if you push it too far, they're an impediment to the adoption of reduced rates. Effectiveness of other management practices for nitrogen is variable and or not clearly demonstrated, and I'll unpack a couple of those in the next couple of slides. There's limited evidence about the impact on water quality from the management of phosphorus in crop production. There's very few studies on the water quality impacts of phosphorus management. Also, there's not a lot known about nitrogen in crops, the water quality impacts of nitrogen crops other than sugarcane. And there's also quite limited evidence on the cost effectiveness of many of the practices for improving water quality. We do know, as we know, that reducing fertiliser applications reduces losses of nitrogen. We also know that reducing erosion reduces sediments, which is particulate nutrients, which can turn into dissolved nutrients. And while we said in the previous slide that these nutrients bound up in sediments can transform into dissolved forms, those processes are still fairly poorly understood. So in the management practices chapter, we were tasked with focusing on a few things in a bit more detail. One of them is irrigation, so it's obviously very relevant to crop production in the Burdekin. And I suppose the main conclusion there is it limited information on the effect of improved irrigation practices on discharge of dissolved nitrogen, dissolved P, and on productivity. Most information that we assessed came from mechanistic modelling studies. There haven't been a lot of information that was included in the consensus statement from experimental studies. Well-designed and managed, automated furrow systems can be profitable, so that was quite clear. But the water quality outcome of those systems was generally not included in the results of the studies that allowed us to draw that economic conclusion. And looking at bananas, which I know is perhaps a bit less relevant to the Burdekin, but there's limited evidence of automated irrigation systems providing economic benefits in bananas. I think it's fairly clear that very high irrigation efficiency is likely to result in reduced dissolved inorganic nitrogen discharges. But if you push this too far, there's a risk that it will reduce the yield and hence the profitability of the crop. And just where that tipping point is not clear. And most of the studies, and I've emphasised published there in italics because it was the published referee literature that we're looking at, and we know that there's a lot of other information around, but most of the published studies didn't provide enough detail on the methodologies that they used, or the results that were able to draw reliable conclusions about either the water quality or the economic outcomes. Another area that we focused on was enhanced efficiency fertilisers, EEFs. And we know that applying EEF has a potential to reduce nitrogen losses, to whether that's to water or to the atmosphere, because it potentially allows crops to take up nitrogen for longer. The benefits, however, are highly variable in space and time. And there's been some really good work done to explain why that variability comes around. And that's because that's from looking at the ways that EEF works and hence the conditions that need to be met for an EEF to be effective at a site in a given season. So the length of time that nitrogen is maintained in the soil in the ammonium form, as opposed to the nitrate form, it's a nitrate form that's mobile, must sort of match that over which the crops are taking up nitrogen. So, for example, if you delay the transformation to the immobile to the mobile form of nitrogen by only a week and the crop hasn't really started growing, you're not going to get a benefit from the EEF. And that time from it takes for the immobile form, ammonium, to transform into the mobile form, nitrate, is quite variable between different products and also between the soil environment. There also must be rainfall events during the time when the nitrogen is in the immobile form. So if there is no rainfall, which will leach the nitrogen out of the soil if it's mobile occurring, then there's no advantage of having the nitrogen in the immobile form. So you don't get an advantage from an enhanced efficiency fertiliser. And then finally, if those prerequisites 1 and 2 do mean that you've got more plant available nitrogen in the soil, the crop has to be able to respond to that nitrogen. So, if this, for example, that extra nitrogen is there late in the season, the crop's already taken up the nitrogen that it needs, then there's no benefit to having that extra nitrogen there. Or if growth is constrained by some other factor, very cloudy weather, low solar radiation or waterlogging, there's no advantage of that nitrogen. So those, you've got to get your ducks really lined up for enhanced efficiency fertilisers to be effective. And those conditions occurring, plus the role of climate, which influences, we've said, rainfall and other things like that, and the complexity of the soil environment, causes this high variability across time and space. And what we do see is that if over large numbers of experiments, large body of works, you aggregate the data, you look at average responses and things, you can see benefits from EEFs. But to take an average benefit, an average benefit across multiple sites and then say, how is this going to happen to an individual field in an individual year, you can't make that sort of deduction that general benefit will necessarily happen at that time, at that place. Moving on to wetlands, the global evidence about tropical wetlands is very positive. They can retain and process dissolved nutrients, and that natural or near natural wetlands are more effective than restored wetlands. the hydrology and the presence of vegetation are important factors in maximising nutrient removal. I think this, for example, if a wetland has lots of sediments accumulated in it, and so its depth it becomes very shallow over time, and there's no vegetation in there, well, it's not going to be as effective as something that's deeper with a lot more vegetation. Those first 3 points are fairly general and well established, but there are few studies in Great Barrier Reef catchments that provide either empirical evidence or modelled evidence on the water quality efficacy or the cost of wetlands. And then the historical loss of wetlands and the degradation of those remaining, both from the vegetation and a hydrological point of view, and the needs for ongoing maintenance of restored wetlands. If they're not set and forget, they need to be maintained. They're important considerations for looking at how wetlands can be maximally efficient in protecting GBR. All right.
Okay. Oh, you're just about wrapped up. I was just going to ask you to kind of maybe wrap up in the next few minutes, but I feel like
I'll wrap up at sort of right now.
Fantastic. Look at him go. Well done, Peter. Thank you.
Shall I stop sharing?
Thank you. So you got a preemptive round of applause, but if you did have any final remarks, yeah, please go ahead.
No, I think the final remarks would probably be a couple of things. Some of the main messages out of the dissolved nutrient sections haven't changed an awful lot compared to some of the previous consensus statements. Some of the stories are emerging, and there's still quite a few things that we don't know. But on the other hand, there are lots of things that we do know pretty clearly.